In the UK, the promised Freedom Day is on the horizon, and yet nobody's happy. An attribution study shows just how extraordinary was the recent heatwave in the US and Canada, and a leaked draft of the IPCC 2022 report has many convinced that it's the end of the world. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. July 19th is Freedom Day. You remember Freedom Day? It was going to be in June, but now July the 19th is Freedom Day and life is going to be back to semi-normal. The Prime Minister told us that it's time to use our own judgment. Except the legacy of incompetent and dumb policy remains, because it turns out that fully vaccinated people will still have to follow self-isolation rules if they are pinged by the NHS app for a full extra month. So now the pubs and the cinemas and all the other venues can open to capacity crowds, and then one person who attends gets a positive test and ping to all of the others around them. All those fully vaccinated people have to isolate for 10 days, and that can include the pub staff, effectively meaning that they're shut again. Unsurprisingly, a lot of people are observing this isn't exactly what they imagined that Freedom Day would look like. And this is a real issue because as society has opened up over the last few weeks, the numbers of cases has naturally gone up, which is exactly as expected. Which also therefore means that it's harder to avoid passing close enough to someone to register on your NHS app. So far, the government's response to the complaints about this is to mutter that maybe they need to make the app less sensitive so it doesn't ping so easily. Admirably responsive while being terminally stupid at the same time. So far, the number of hospitalisations and deaths are very low, although hospitalisations have increased. That might not in itself be a problem, except that NHS staff are in the same situation. Large numbers of them are being forced into self-isolation because they get pinged by the app. They've been vaccinated. They have work to do treating patients, but they have to isolate for 10 days anyway because stupid. And what do people do when faced with stupid? Generally, they try to navigate around it to do the sensible thing. So thousands of vaccinated NHS staff and citizens generally, by all accounts, have been deleting the NHS app to avoid those nonsensical outcomes. They were happy to have it on their phone when it was useful. Why would you keep it on your phone when it's become a vehicle for inflicting stupid on you? Because let's be clear, there is a case for not opening up, weaker though it may be than it was before, and there is a case for opening up. There is no case for opening up whilst wreaking havoc by applying the rules of the former to the latter. Of course, politicians are under pressure, but this is their job. The pressure's not going to go away anytime soon, because there will always be those arguing that what is about to be done is going to cause catastrophe. And so we've seen a letter published in The Lancet made the case that ending the restrictions is dangerous and premature. And this was echoed by the outspoken Mike Ryan, head of the WHO's Emergencies Programme. Ryan had previously said that 80% vaccination rates were the way out of the pandemic. Yeah, that was last month. This month, he said that the idea that high vaccination rates would prevent surges in hospitalisation and deaths was a dangerous assumption. And whatever the circumstances, you can always rely on scientists associated with the government's SAGE advisory group to show up on TV and in the press to stick the boot into the government they're supposedly advising. So, for instance, Professor Stephen Riker, a psychologist, he said that the new Health Secretary's message that we had to learn to live with COVID-19 as we have learned to live with the flu is, quote, frightening. He accused him of wanting to ditch all protections while only half of us are vaccinated. To be fair though, Professor Riker, it is the vulnerable half, 2/3 of adults in fact. And Christopher Snowdon made the point rather powerfully when he reproduced this front page from December 31st, 2020 with the comment, "Find me anyone, scientist, politician, pundit, anyone, who said in January that we should still have restrictions in August even if 2/3 of adults were double jabbed and 86% had had one jab." And it's a fair reflection of the fact that the goalposts keep shifting. There are always voices saying that the obvious and humane thing is to delay opening a bit longer for a few more to get vaccinated. How many more? A few more than today. I mean, that's always the answer. However many there are today, a few more would be better. Interestingly, the new Health Secretary Sajid Javid authored a research paper back in December last year where he accused world leaders of herd behaviour in their COVID response, likened them to panic shoppers who hoarded toilet paper. This suggests that he will be somewhat more robust in the face of pressure than his predecessor. We never used to think that governments could protect every one of us from harm from diseases. Somehow we now think that's not only possible, but a dereliction of duty if they don't. This goes against any principle of the population learning to live with COVID. No, COVID is not the same as the flu, but part of learning to live with it is going to be about treating it like the flu. Those vulnerable will be recommended to get their booster shots every year. Others will get on with life knowing that you can catch things, some of them more unpleasant than others. Young people know that the risks to them are on the low side, and we're seeing that because in the UK, as elsewhere, vaccination rates are declining now that the young are more opting to pass the vaccine by. That may change as the differential in freedom between fully vaccinated and unvaccinated for holidays and attending live events becomes more of an issue. But in either way, it's not the end of the world, especially as we expect treatments to continue to improve. Because, of course, one of the valid riposts has been, but what about long COVID? Lots of people have been getting this ongoing, debilitating set of symptoms, breathlessness, memory problems, all sorts of things, just dragging on for months and months. I mean, horrible to have such a thing. Treatments will improve for that. Indeed, there was news this week that German doctors are looking into an experimental heart drug that seemed to cure a 59-year-old man of long COVID within hours. BC007, a compound developed by the German biotech company Berlin Cures. It clears up a kind of auto-antibody, a clump of protein produced by the immune system that circulates in the blood and can damage the heart and other organs. Obviously, there's a lot of work to be done to properly test it. Promising early results for a drug are never the final answer. And that's a perfect segue to talking about next Monday's video. I covered previously some of the evidence and the arguments that have been going on about whether the off-patent drug Ivermectin is effective in treating COVID-19. The situation then was that there were studies suggesting that it was, but they were not considered to be high quality. Basically, all we could do was to await proper clinical trials. Now, however, we have two important studies published by peer-reviewed journals or in the process. One is a meta-analysis. It reviews the various small studies that have been undertaken and concludes that ivermectin is highly effective for treating COVID-19. The other one is a meta-analysis. It reviews the same universe of small studies that have been undertaken and concludes that ivermectin is of no value whatsoever in treating COVID-19. Now, you might wonder how both of these studies can exist in the universe at the same time. Well, I decided to do a deep dive into that question because it's interesting. What are the facts here? And it turns out to be highly instructive, gives us a few insights as to where the body of evidence on that specific topic may be going. I will be looking at all of that in the video going live on this channel at 7 p.m. on Monday next week. See you then. A rapid attribution study has suggested that the extreme heat wave that hit the northwest of the US and Canada a couple of weeks ago would have been virtually impossible without global warming. The science of attributing specific events to climate change is in its infancy, although researchers have claimed progress over the last year. Nevertheless, this is one of those where they suggest there are relatively few ambiguities. The study observed that the fact that temperatures lay so far outside the range of historically observed temperatures means that it's hard to quantify how rare the event was, about a 1 in 1,000 year event in today's climate. This graph is somewhat instructive. It shows maximum temperatures in Portland with 3 blue lines, one for 1 in 10 year events, one for 1 in 100 year events, and one for 1 in 1,000 year events. And then sat way above them all is June the 28th, 2021. That said, I'm not quite sure about the scale on that graph, since there seem to have been 8 1 in 100 year events in the last century. But look, you get the general idea. This event is exceptional, outside the normal flow of highs and lows. The circumstances that caused that event had a different dynamic than all of the other heat waves of the last century. And that happens sometimes with extreme events. Dr. Robert Rode used the analogy of a hurricane. 100 years of normal rainfall data isn't going to be any use to you as a predictor if you get hit by an unprecedented hurricane, because it's so substantively different in its dynamics. The rules underpinning your historical data set are just not useful. The question is whether it remains a 1 in 1,000 year event or whether we've passed some sort of tipping point that means this new dynamic of event has become possible that never used to happen before. While recognising that latter question of a tipping point, the report observed nevertheless that the climate models haven't hinted at such an effect and such a tipping point to date. The climate models have predicted a number of things we wouldn't have intuitively expected, such as the North Atlantic cold blob, but certainly not this. Which perhaps leaves us with the most likely explanation being what the report describes as the statistical equivalent of really bad luck, albeit aggravated by climate change. The reference to a tipping point, though, is all very topical. Last week there was a supposed leak of a draft IPCC report that will be properly reporting next year, and do you imagine that everyone was reporting how sunny and optimistic that report was? Well, of course they weren't. Here was The Guardian doing what The Guardian does. IPCC steps up warning on climate tipping points in leaked draft report. Except technically no. The report has a lot of changes to go through before it gets published, so the IPCC is neither stepping up nor stepping down anything until that happens. But, headlines. And then there are subheadlines, of course. Scientists increasingly concerned about thresholds beyond which recovery may become impossible. Now, I would just say a couple of things in response to this so-called story. First, that the IPCC report may well end up saying what it suggests here: we won't know until it's published. But it's presented as though the IPCC is sitting on this secret bad news that it's due to unleash upon the world, at which point there will be the wailing and gnashing of teeth as we slide headlong into the abyss. The truth is that all the IPCC does is collect together and consider the existing published research. People may decide to take an issue seriously in the light of recent contributions to emphasise a particular theme, but there aren't big, shocking, bedwetting surprises from the science as they seem to imply here. The interesting thing to question is why the draft has been leaked in the first place. What might that person, the leaker, what might they be aiming to achieve by that? It's significant that the entire focus of the Guardian story is on the issue of tipping points. There are a number of scientists who have been pushing relatively alarmist messages around tipping points for quite some time. It's amplifying and exaggerating those concerns that is the meat and drink, or perhaps I should say the tofu and drink, of the activists of Extinction Rebellion. You might think that someone wanting to send what they think is a helpful message to the COP26 conference in November, perhaps someone responsible for writing the first draft, or someone close to a person doing that, maybe that person knows that their strong, uncompromising first draft will almost certainly be reined in by the published process. The dreadful old conservative establishment that is the IPCC, but by leaking this early version, they can get the stronger campaigning message out there in advance of the summit. Even if it's going to get written out of the first draft, it gets to make headlines right here and right now. Now that's speculation. I'm not speaking from any inside knowledge, but these things don't happen by accident. Somebody wanted to achieve something by doing this, and tipping points is the campaigner's area of focus of choice. Meanwhile, some of the comments by other scientists on Twitter have been instructive. Climate scientist campaigner Catherine Hayhoe did a Twitter thread in response to the leak, and she said this: "We scientists often assume everyone thinks like us. If we just tell them the facts, we assume they'll get it. They'll understand why this is so bad and they'll take action. Our job is done. But now things are changing. We've realised that if we don't spell out the fact that it's our civilization we've put on the chopping block ourselves in words that everyone can understand, emphasising risks that matter to everyone on this planet, who will? And that's why this new IPCC report is so blunt. Climate change isn't just one more priority on our already overcrowded list. What that tells you is that as far as hey-ho is concerned, the science is what the science is, but the underlying narrative has got to up its game. It's all got to become a campaign vehicle. And that seems evident from this article in Politico, which says the scientist report takes a swipe at ExxonMobil. Well, that's not the science of climate change, that is a campaign attack. Not everyone else was stepping in to seize the campaign opportunity, however. So Richard Bett said this: pretty weird to be reading these articles about the IPCC AR6WG2 report while I am literally actually writing the IPCC AR6WG2 report. I might change my bits just to confuse everyone. Actually, we have already changed quite a bit anyway after the thousands of review comments, which is maybe hinting that not all of those things headlined are necessarily going to make it into the final draft. Zeke Housefather commented on the Guardian article specifically. They have also a rather confused discussion of tipping points around permafrost. In reality, there is no single climate threshold for permafrost, different regions of the Arctic fall at different rates. So the situation is as serious as we knew it to be, no more, no less. But as we get closer to COP26, expect to see campaigners amplifying whatever they think will make their message more powerful. And in the meantime, as you would expect, Twitter is full of people convinced that the IPCC is about to announce the end of the world. Tweets which frankly read remarkably like all the ones claiming that the vaccines are a secret plot to bring in the Great Reset. They wouldn't thank you for pointing it out. In a minute, we'll get to replying to some comments and the final thought for the week. But first, it's time for the July livestream. Again. That's right, it's exactly what I said last week. But then someone pointed out that the England football team was in the process of doing the unlikely, making it to the semi-final of the Europe Cup, and that match would be happening on that Wednesday evening. Scandalous though I find the idea that people would rather watch 22 grown men kicking a bag of wind around a field rather than join a live stream on YouTube. Sometimes you just gotta recognise the evidence might be against you. So instead, it will be happening next week. As usual, I'll be chatting about what's most topical at the time before taking comments and questions from the live chat. And I even checked to make sure that the final isn't happening on that evening, because that's the kind of rigorous research we do here. So no reason whatsoever why you shouldn't join me then, Wednesday 7 PM UK time. See you there. 2 comments on the last video on critical race theory. I guess the follow-up video should be to inspect the claim that CRT is part of an attack on Western values. It may not be orchestrated, but I do feel that the underlying values are eroded at an unprecedented pace. Is that the case? Before we have any discussion like that, we just have to check that we agree on what's meant by the term Western values. Generally, it's held to cover rationalism, self-criticism, the disinterested search for truth, the separation of church and state, the rule of law, equality before the law, meritocracy, freedom of conscience and expression, human rights, and liberal democracy. Generally, I would expect that CRT academics would say that such values are not challenged by CRT. Indeed, they'd even say that CRT challenges Western societies to live up to their promises of delivering equality before the law. Their contention is that the law and other institutions are founded on racism, so undermine the principles of the rule of law. In the disinterested search for truth, though, I'd have to say actual supporting evidence of those contentions is limited. But, believing a thing without evidence is a very common phenomenon, nothing to do with CRT per se, nothing unusual there. However, some of the populist offshoots of CRT do start to move more into that territory. So campaigners who argue that the disinterested search for truth, the value placed on competence and meritocracy, those in themselves are a reflection of white supremacy. You see this sometimes stated in public and open to ridicule, more often as a reinforced cultural thing, black people being told by their peers that acting white is not how they should be behaving and how you define that. CRT scholars would loudly protest that doesn't come from them, but it is a consequential theme from the insistence of focusing on outcomes, not opportunities and process. If you're not going to be telling people that they should be working hard and valuing education, but instead you're going to insist that differential outcomes that affect them are purely because of systemic racism, then you do create the circumstances, the logical conclusion of which is to argue against meritocracy per se. Now, it's quite hard to argue against meritocracy. I mean, the evidence for its effectiveness as a system is overwhelming through history. But if you can label it as white supremacy and make it a moral failing, then to some extent you can sidestep that evidence. So there are things that are certainly corrosive to the values that we associate with. And as far as I can see, they are largely to the detriment of the people that CRT purports to represent. You twice say those claiming CRT has been misrepresented sounds like activism or political campaigning. Is only one side to be allowed to do this? Pella is writing an opinion piece. It says so at the top. Of course it is campaigning in the broad sense. All opinion pieces are. No, you miss my point. Activism is written into critical race theory. It's an academic framework that says it only exists to be put into action in practice. It's not an academic study that seeks to explain the world. In its own words, it's an academic rationale for why and how you should change the world. And that then shapes the nature of the discussion that we're having about it. So yes, I quoted several CRT academics penning opinion pieces, but the things I pointed to were how they were describing what CRT is, and it was explained as a vehicle for change, not just one for study. Doesn't make them bad people, doesn't make them wrong, but it validated some of the criticisms about the appropriateness of its teaching in schools specifically, which is what we were talking about. As I showed, the California Ethnic Studies curriculum explicitly sought to recruit students to actively support social justice causes. It's built in to its perspective. To give an alternative example, I personally think we should be getting on now with acting to decarbonise our energy sources in the face of climate change. The evidence supports that we should do that. But in schools, I would expect to see children taught about the science of the climate, the evidence that suggests it's changing, maybe some of the debates around what that means for policies so that they can understand them. I don't support schools teaching their children how to become activists with Extinction Rebellion or anything like that. Where that happens, it should be similarly condemned. Children, of course, remain free to decide for themselves what they care about enough to become active about. Look, another rather different analogy for comic effect. In this modern age, we probably all agree that our teenage children should undertake sex education classes. We would probably draw the line at the idea that it should go as far as sex training classes. When I first started this channel, I'm not sure that I would even have been able to articulate any sort of mission that I had in mind for it. But as it evolved, I found my mindset evolving with it. I moved from a sense of ill-defined wanting to promote things, worthy things, change makers who wanted to make things happen, to instead wanting to understand things and to explain them. And I figured that my position as a floating voter, a pragmatist, an anti-ideologue possibly meant that role was a good fit. That was massively backed up by some research that I saw this week for the first time on the perception gap. The perception gap shows the gulf between what Democrats think that Republicans think and what they actually do think, and what Republicans think that Democrats think, and again, what Democrats actually do think. It shouldn't be a huge surprise that the extreme wings of both parties have the most mistaken beliefs about what the other side thinks. And that comes with the other obvious realisation. I quote, "And which is the most accurate segment? Surprisingly, it's the politically disengaged. They are fully 3 times more accurate in their estimates of political opponents than members of either of these wing groups. The V-shaped perception gap shows that the less invested you are in politics today, the less distorted your perception of politics." And you see this reinforced in the traditional ways that people engage. Those who follow the mainstream news most actively should, you would think, be the best informed. But no, the most engaged with the news have the biggest perception gap, because news sources tend to dramatise to attract the audience to benefit the advertisers. The more dramatic and obvious sources on the right do, as you might expect, feed the biggest perception gap. Breitbart News, Red State, The Drudge Report. But not so far behind other left-wing versions, Slate, BuzzFeed, The Huffington Post, and some way behind them, but still attached to a significant perception gap, is journals like the New York Times and the Washington Post, which are worse on this scale than Fox News, albeit only just. And this has its biggest impact in how activists project bad intentions onto their opponents. A large majority of the extreme activists on both sides see the other side as brainwashed, hateful and racist. Only minorities in those groups will credit the other side as having the qualities of being honest, reasonable and caring. In other words, if you want your commentary to feed your bias in how you hate the other side and assume they're all extremists out to destroy America, then the extreme ideologue commentators are where you will go. But they will not give you an accurate picture, just one that reinforces and maybe deepens your own misperceptions. To more accurately perceive what's going on, what people's intent is, what motivates them and all of the rest of it, it helps if you don't actually care so much about the outcomes in a tribal way. Not that you wouldn't rather the world was a better place and we could avoid the negative impacts of bad policies or man-made disasters or whatever, but you divorce yourself from a side and go purely on the principle of what's true without fear nor favour. Having a vision for how the world can be better and fighting for it is fine. People like that change the world, sometimes even for the better. But as much as anything right now, in this polarised moment, we need more people who leave that to others and instead try to provide a service in just honestly and energetically asking the question, what's true here? What does the other side say? What do the facts support? Can we dare to ask the questions, the answers which may not suit our preferences, even the questions that the mainstream would rather you weren't asking? I still don't know how to build a large audience on that proposition, especially with YouTube actively working against me as it currently is, but the perception gap research made me more convinced than ever that it's worth a try. By the way, speaking of YouTube's ongoing throttling of the channel, I was digging deeper into the analytics this week, and they all confirm what's going on. I've shared with you before the traffic graph. Well, have a look at these. This one shows where traffic comes from. The big three sources are browse features, when YouTube shows your video on people's home pages, suggested videos, the line of videos down the side of the one that you're watching, and YouTube search. As the channel was growing between November to March, YouTube was showing it to new audiences more and suggesting it more. Then in early March, just after the first lab leak video and the review of the transgender issues book that was banned on Amazon, suddenly hardly any suggested videos. And the more granular, jagged blue line, I think, is just promotion to existing subscribers. A belief that's supported by this graph. The blue line is non-subscribers, the green line is subscribers. Even before the channel started to get traction in its earlier phases, the blue line, non-subscribers, was always significantly above subscribers. And obviously during the period when YouTube was starting to suggest my videos more actively, that was much more so. And any YouTuber will tell you you expect peaks and troughs in that sort of activity, but since early March, that blue line has floored. Barely any non-subscribers at all. No peaks, nothing. Just the steady little hills on the green line. My regular viewers who are also subscribers. That would be you, I expect. It's clear evidence that YouTube is simply refusing to promote any video from this channel to new audiences. I mean, that is the smoking gun graph. And it's why certain videos would take flights at least into the 20 to 30k zone traditionally, but nothing like that since early March. Evergreen videos that were being recommended and getting views long after they'd been published, all of them mysteriously dried up at the same time. So, of course, I'm going to tell you at this point how much I value the people who support this channel on Patreon. I mean, look at that graph. Without those people and without the regular and gratifying engagement with the green line, that's you, I couldn't conceivably keep going in the face of that. Because of those patrons, I can continue to produce videos regularly, do all the research that goes into them, and feel that it's worth it. If you would like to add your support for the independent, fact-focused and non-ideological content that I aim to produce here, please go to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. It is always appreciated. Either way, have a great week. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.